His feet were already buried in snow. The road no longer existed. Blas could see no more than a few varas in front of him, and once or twice the violent, swirling snow cut off his vision entirely, leaving only a gauzy, suffocating whiteness. The men were calling out in terror and loneliness. Blas stumbled into an ox that had lost its bearing across the line of march. He fell and sliced open his knee on a rock. Cazadoras, he called as he stood up. Cazadoras are sharpshooters, basically skirmishers. Take hold of the cross belt of the man in front of you. Walk slowly, carefully. But the howling wind took his words as soon as they came out of his mouth and bore them away. He kept stumbling over bodies of men who had fallen. He slapped the terror out of them and got them back on their feet. Men hung onto his own cross belt as if onto the skirt of their mothers. Several times he fell, bringing 5 or 6 men down with him, then rallying them back onto their numb, bruised feet to march into the whiteness that led nowhere, neither forward nor back, only deeper within its borderless zone. Finally, it became apparent that the army could travel no farther. The road was lost beneath the snow, and in the tumultuous whiteness, all human instincts about which way to go were buried as well. The words came down for the men to bivouac for the night, wherever they were standing. When Blas announced this order to his cazadores, they crowded around him as if he might have some kind of answer to their misery. The men looked as frightened and bewildered as if they had suddenly found themselves standing on the moon instead of the familiar earth. They cringed in the cold wind, clutching their pathetically thin blankets over their shoulders. Their mustaches and eyebrows were sheathed in ice. Each one of their faces bore a look of perfect, abject pain. Somewhere with the army there were carts carrying firewood, but no one knew where they were. Blas sent 2 platoons out to gather wood, though the mesquite trees surrounding the road were only intermittently visible in the blowing snow, and though he knew the limbs would be green and hard to burn. He ordered the bugler to sound assembly every 5 minutes so that the men in the firewood details could find their way back. Then he took 20 men and groped through the storm until he located 4 of the company's supply carts. He ordered the arrieros to empty the carts and cache whatever could not be used immediately for shelter, and then turned the carts over on their sides to form a windbreak. Soon, with wood stolen from the crates or from the least essential parts of the carts themselves, they had fires going, and in time they were hot enough to catch the green wood that the firewood gatherers, numb and nearly lifeless, brought back from the mesquite forest. Then there was nothing to do but endure it. The men clung to each other in the lee of the overturned wagons. Few of them could move anymore, or even speak. The strength kept shivering out of them. Blas tried once or twice to get them singing, hoping to rouse their spirits, but none of them took it up, and he was not sure if his voice was even audible beyond the confines of his own skull. The fires burned down at an alarming rate, and the flames seemed to consume the green wood without producing any perceptible heat at all. Blas organized another wood-gathering expedition, selecting the strongest men, the ones he thought had the best chance of surviving it. The sun had long since set, the cold was immeasurably sharper, but the night itself was strangely invisible. It was as if the day's horrible whiteness had simply grown deeper and more impenetrable. The men moaned as he led them out into the biting wind. All at once, the negligible warmth of the fire seemed like a luxurious refuge. Blas felt the cold as a savage assault. He could not feel his grip on the hatchet he carried and worried that it had already slipped out of his hand. Behind, holding onto his crossbelt, matching each step to his, was Hurtado. The other teams had been swallowed up. They came to the mesquite trees. The bean pods rattled in the wind. The snowdrifts were almost up to their knees, and Blas knew that the chances of finding dead wood on the ground were poor. They had to cut the living limbs, which were thin and wiry and drooping with snow. Thorns bit into their hands. Blas and his men had neither the strength nor the tools to chop through the trunks of the trees to produce the big heartwood logs that would allow them to survive the night almost in comfort. All he and Hurtado could do was to try to cut off the smaller branches which danced in the wind like whips. Blas held the limb steady, lacerating his hands on the thorns, while Hurtado held the hatchet in both hands and, weak and blinded by the snow, chopped at the place where the limb joined the tree. As often as not, his blows missed, sometimes striking air, sometimes merely scarring the trunk. After an eternity of effort, they had amassed only a spindly stack of wood, enough fuel for perhaps 10 minutes of this long night. But it was all they could carry, and Hurtado was quaking uncontrollably. "Let's go back," Blas said. Hurtado nodded his head and started to walk off in an indiscriminate direction, his mind as numb as his body. Blas grabbed him and held him in place until they heard the bugle call, and then they set off in that direction. Others from the wood-gathering detail came out of the storm and joined them on the way back, each man cradling a load of wood in his bleeding and swollen hands. Finally, they could see the fires glowing softly in the haze, the most welcome sight Blas had ever witnessed. He dropped his wood directly on one of the fires and made the bugler keep sounding assembly until he had satisfied himself that all of the wood gatherers had made it back, and then he collapsed near the flames. The fire awakened his bloody, frozen hands to shrieking pain. The sudden warmth, the towering flames as the new wood was consumed, was almost worse than the cold. The way that the pain in his hands kept building in intensity reminded him of some hellish bugle call, a shrill, eternal note, never changing in pitch, never breaking off into music. Incredibly, he slept. From time to time, the frozen wind simply sheared away his awareness, and then he woke up again into the unabating storm. In his wakeful moments, Blas worried and knew about the sick men in the ambulance wagons, about Alpiciera lying next to his field forge, but there was nothing he could do. He sailed off into sleep again until a desperate, strangled sound brought him back. "What is it?" he shouted reflexively before he even understood if he was awake or remembered their hideous situation. "It's that mule," Hurtado said. A veil of blowing snow parted, and Blas could see the form of a mule standing outside the fire and a tight circle of men hunched around it. The mule continued to emit a tortured bray that was keen enough to pierce through the wind, but still strangely muffled. The animal disappeared from sight in a fresh gust of wind and then was revealed again more clearly, a bright sheen of ice covering its nose. "Somebody shut that mule up," one of the cazadores cried. "Somebody shoot it." "My hands are too numb to pull a trigger," someone else replied, after a long silence in which the mule continued to torture them with its cries. "It can't breathe," Blas said. He stood up on his stiff, cramped legs and grabbed a hatchet. He staggered through the snow-covered mounds that represented his men and approached the mule. The creature was still braying in panic, but it seemed to know enough not to run away as Blas reached out and grabbed its ear in one hand, and with the other he struck on its frozen nose with the blunt end of the hatchet. The ice covering its nostrils broke like window glass, and the mule began to snort and gasp, and intoxicated now with the miracle of breath, began to prance back and forth in the weak glow of the firelight. Blas went back to his place and sat down again. Throughout the endless night, the mule kept coming back, with the ice once again covering its nose, and the cazadores took turns standing up with a hatchet and restoring its breath. Blas had saved it. No one wanted to see it die.